Murderers, predators, rapists, gang leaders, drug kingpins. We need some of those folks behind bars. Our communities are safer. Thanks to brave police officers and hard-working prosecutors who put those violent criminals in jail. And the studies show that up to a certain point, tougher prosecutors and stiffer sentences for these violent offenders contributed to the decline in violent crime over the last few decades. Although the science also indicates that you get a point of diminishing returns. But it is important for us to recognize that violence in our communities is serious and that historically, in fact, the African American community oftentimes was under-policed rather than over-policed. Folks were very interested in containing the African American community so it couldn't leave segregated areas. But within those areas there wasn't enough police presence. But here's the thing, over the last few decades, we've also locked up more and more nonviolent drug offenders than ever before, for longer than ever before. And that is the real reason our prison population is so high. In far too many cases, the punishment simply does not fit the crime. If you're a low-level drug dealer, or you violate your parole, you owe some debt to society. You have to be held accountable and make amends. But you don't owe 20 years. You don't owe a life sentence. That's disproportionate to the price that should be paid. And by the way, the taxpayers are picking up the tab for that price. Every year, we spend $80 billion to keep folks incarcerated. $80 billion. Now, just to put that in perspective, for $80 billion, we could have universal preschool for every 3-year-old and 4-year-old in America. That's what $80 billion buys. For $80 billion. We could double the salary of every high school teacher in America. For what we spend to keep everyone locked up for 1 year. We could eliminate tuition at every single one of our public colleges and universities. As Republican Senator and presidential candidate Rand Paul has said no, and to his credit. He's been consistent on this issue, imprisoning large numbers of nonviolent drug offenders for long periods of time. Costs the taxpayers money, without making them any safer. Roughly 1/3 of the Justice Department's budget now goes toward incarceration. 1/3. And there are outstanding public servants at our Justice Department, starting with our outstanding Attorney General. Loretta Lynch, and we've got some great prosecutors here today, and they do outstanding work, so many of them. But every dollar they have to spend keeping nonviolent drug offenders in prison is a dollar they can't spend going after drug kingpins, or tracking down terrorists. Or hiring more police and giving them the resources that would allow them to do a more effective job community policing. And then, of course, there are costs that can't be measured in dollars and cents. Because the statistics on who gets incarcerated show that by a wide margin. It disproportionately impacts communities of color. African Americans and Latinos make up 30% of our population, they make up 60% of our inmates. About 1 in every 35 African American men, 1 in every 88 Latino men is serving time right now. Among white men, that number is 1 in 214. The bottom line is that in too many places, black boys and black men, Latino boys and Latino men experience being treated differently under the law. And I want to be clear, this is not just anecdote. This is not just barbershop talk. A growing body of research shows that people of color are more likely to be stopped, frisked, questioned, charged, detained. African Americans are more likely to be arrested. They are more likely to be sentenced to more time for the same crime. What is that doing to our communities? What's that doing to those children? Our nation is being robbed of men and women who could be workers and taxpayers. Could be more actively involved in their children's lives, could be role models. Could be community leaders, and right now they're locked up for a nonviolent offense. So our criminal justice system isn't as smart as it should be. It's not keeping us as safe as it should be. It is not as fair as it should be. Mass incarceration makes our country worse off, and we need to do something about it. But here's the good news. Audience member: all right, good news. President Obama, good news. Don't get me preaching now. I am feeling more hopeful today because even now, when Let's face it. It seems like Republicans and Democrats cannot agree on anything. A lot of them agree on this. In fact, today, back in Washington, Republican senators from Utah and Texas are joining Democratic senators from New Jersey and Rhode Island to talk about how Congress can pass meaningful criminal justice reform this year. That doesn't happen very often. And it's not just senators. This is a cause that's bringing people in both houses of Congress together. It's created some unlikely bedfellows. You've got Van Jones and Newt Gingrich. You've got Americans for Tax Reform and the ACLU. You've got the NAACP and the Koch brothers. No. You've got to give them credit. You've got to call it like you see it. There are states from Texas and South Carolina to California and Connecticut who have acted to reduce their prison populations over the last 5 years and seen their crime rates fall. That's good news. My administration has taken steps on our own to reduce our federal prison population. So I signed a bill reducing the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. I've commuted the sentences of dozens of people sentenced under old drug laws that we now recognize were unfair. And yesterday I announced that I'm commuting dozens more. Under the leadership of Attorney General Eric Holder, now continued by Loretta Lynch Federal. Prosecutors got what he called smart on crime, which is refocusing efforts on the worst offenders. pursuing mandatory minimum sentences 20% less often than they did the year before. The idea is you don't always have to charge the max. To be a good prosecutor, you need to be proportionate. And it turns out that we're solving just as many cases. And there are just as many plea bargains, and it's working. It's just that we've eliminated some of the excess. And recently, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in 40 years, America's crime rate and incarceration rate both went down at the same time. That happened last year. So there's some momentum building for reform. There's evidence mounting for why we need reform. Now I want to spend the rest of my time just laying out some basic principles. Some simple ideas for what reform should look like. Because we're just at the beginning of this process and we need to make sure that we stay with it. And I'm going to focus on what happens in 3 places in the community. In the courtroom, and in the cell block. So I want to begin with the community because I believe crime is like any other epidemic. The best time to stop it is before it even starts. So one study found that for every dollar we invest in pre-K, we save at least twice that down the road in reduced crime. Getting a teenager a job for the summer costs a fraction of what it costs to lock him up for 15 years. Investing in our communities makes sense. It saves taxpayer money if we are consistent about it. And if we recognize that every child deserves opportunity, not just some, not just our own. What doesn't make sense is treating entire neighborhoods as little more than danger zones where we just surround them. We ask police to go in there and do the tough job of trying to contain the hopelessness when we are not willing to make the investments to help lift those communities out of hopelessness. That's not just a police problem, that's a societal problem. Places like West Philly, or West Baltimore, or Ferguson, Missouri, they're part of America, too. They're not separate. If you are a parent, you know that there are times where boys and girls are going to act out in school. And the question is, are we letting principals and parents deal with one set of kids? And we call the police on another set of kids. That's not the right thing to do. We've got to make sure our juvenile justice system remembers that kids are different. Don't just tag them as future criminals. Reach out to them as future citizens. And even as we recognize that police officers do one of the toughest bravest jobs around, and as we do everything in our power to keep those police officers safe on the job I've talked about. This we have to restore trust between our police and some of the communities where they serve. And a good place to start is making sure communities around the country adopt the recommendations from the task force I set up that included law enforcement, but also included young people from New York and from Ferguson. and they were able to arrive at a consensus around things like better training. Better data collection to make sure that policing is more effective and more accountable, but is also more unbiased.